Hello, internet friends, real friends, people who are watching this. It was funny. I always find that recording an intro is a lot harder than the live intro, which maybe maybe is a good thing because my intros and real live ones are probably not as funny as I think they are. Welcome back. We're in chapter 7 today, and just to help us give a bit of a recap for chapter 6, Shasta spent the night in the desert with the tombs of the kings, and we met a cat who seems to protect him at night, sleeps with his back up against Shasta, gives Shasta some comfort, and he's deciding whether he should continue to wait or whether he should go and do a raid and kind of go on his way. He's also not sure because two horses have just showed up, Bree and Hwin, who are with somebody he doesn't know. They've just showed up, and they're not dressed as pack horses anymore. They're saddled and bridled, and he's not sure whether he should actually do anything because he's concerned it's a trap. So the last thing we read was he skulked behind the tomb, looking out every few minutes and wondering which was the least dangerous thing to do. And that was the end of chapter 6. So, chapter 7, Aravis and Tashbaan. What had really happened was this. When Aravis saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with two horses who, very wisely, didn't say a word, she never lost her head for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses, and though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take a step, another crier, bother all these people, she thought, was heard shouting out, "Way, way, way for the Tarkheena Sara Lean." And immediately, following the crier, came 4 armed slaves and then 4 bearers carrying a litter, which was all aflutter with silken curtains and all a jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Aravis made her first mistake. She knew Sara Lean, it's a brutal name, Sara Lean, quite well, almost as if they'd been to school together, because they'd often stayed at the same houses and been to the same parties. And Aravis couldn't help looking up to see what Sara Lean looked like now that she was married, and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the two girls met, and immediately Sara Lean sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Aravis, what on earth are you doing here? Your father—" But there was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Aravis let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Sara Lean, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up! Do you hear? Shut up! You must hide me. Tell your people—" "But darling," began Sara Lean in the same loud voice. She didn't mind, at least, making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you, or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Aravis. Please be quick, lass. It's frighteningly important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains off the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found. But do hurry." "All right, darling," said Sara Lean in her lazy voice. "Here, two of you, take the Tarkheena's horse," this was to her slaves, "and now home. I say, darling, do you really think we want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean, to say," but Aravis had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Sara Lean and herself in a rich and scented, but rather stuffy, kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Sara Lean. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? That's better. It's a new one. Do you like it? I got it at—" "Oh, lass, do be serious," said Aravis. "Where is my father?" "Didn't you know?" said Sara Lean. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking everywhere about you. And to think of you and me being together and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I've ever heard." And she went off in giggles. She'd always been a terrible giggler, as Aravis now remembered. "It isn't funny at all," she said. "It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me?" "No difficulty at all, my dear girl," said Sara Lean. "I'll take you home. My husband's away and no one will see you." "Phew, it's not very much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people." You and me and everybody else, Sara Lean. There's no point in having a new dress on if one's to go out shut up like this. I hope no one heard you when you shouted out to me like that, said Aravis. No, of course, darling, said Sara Lean absent-mindedly. But I haven't told you haven't even told me yet what you think of my dress. Another thing, said Aravis, you must tell your people to treat those 2 horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Sara Lean. How exciting. And oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashbaan at the present. They say Prince Rabadash is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all for this last fortnight. I can't see that she's so very pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on the river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my... How shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor dressed like a beggar's brat in your house? It might be so easily got round to my father. Don't keep fussing, there's a dear, said Sara Lean. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bearers had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravis found she was in a courtyard garden, very like the one that Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Sara Lean would have gone indoors at once, but Aravis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Sara Lean. Here, all of you, and you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today. If anyone I catch talking about this young lady, they will be beaten to death and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. When I was a kid, I always thought this scene was kind of funny, and I think it really struck me. I don't think I got that Sara Lean's not overly bright. There's not a lot going on upstairs. So I always thought that the song was really, really funny, or there was something wrong with it. But now that I'm an adult, I realize, yeah, my first impressions were probably right. Although Sara Lean had said she was dying to hear Aravis' story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. In fact, she was much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Aravis having a long and luxurious bath. Colorman baths were famous. And then dressing up her in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Aravis mad. She remembered now that Sara Lean had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Erebus had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other very silly. But when at last they were both seated after a meal, it was chiefly of whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice. It was a beautifully pillared room, which Aravis would have liked better if Sara Lean's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time. Sara Lean at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Aravis had finished telling her story, Sara Lean said, "But, darling, why don't you marry Ahushta Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband says he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Colorman. He has just been made Grand Vizier now old Axartha has died. Didn't you know?" "I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him," said Aravis. "But, darling, only think, 3 palaces, and one of them that beautiful one down by the lake at Ikeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told. Baths of donkey's milk, and you'd see a lot more of me." "He can keep his pearls and palaces for as far as I'm concerned," said Aravis. "You always were a queer girl, Aravis," said Sara Lean. "What more do you want?" In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the Narnia North Gate, and then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Sara Lean had plenty of grooms to spare. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn. But Sara Lean told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going out through the gate would certainly lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Sara Lean clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there is a little water door. Only for palace people, of course, but then, you know, dear," here she tittered a little, We almost are palace people. I say it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisroc, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it is like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabidash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside, and even if we get caught, all would be lost, said Aravis. Oh, darling, don't get excited, said Sara Lean. I was going to say, even if we're caught, I was going to say, even if we weren't caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I've been getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny. I meant it would all be lost for me, said Aravis, a little sharply. Oh, yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of a better plan? Aravis couldn't, and she answered, no. We'll have to risk it. When can we start? Oh, not tonight, said Sara Lean. Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes, and the whole place will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have to be tomorrow night. This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. That afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Sara Lean went out to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her giggling and her talk of dresses and parties, weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Sara Lean wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. And with a peasant boy, too, said Sara Lean. Darling, think of it. It's not nice. Aravis had thought a good deal of it, but she was so tired of Sara Lean's silliness by now that for the first time she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, you forget that I'll be nobody just like him when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised. And to think, said Sara Lean, almost crying, that if only you had sense you could be the wife of a grand vizier. Aravis went away to have a private word with the horses. You must go with the groom a little before sunset, down to the tombs, she said. No more of these packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again. But there'll have to be food in Wynn's saddlebags and a full skin of water in yours, Bree. The man is ordered to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge. And then Narnia in the north, whispered Bree. But what if Shasta is not at the tombs? Wait for him, of course, said Aravis. I hope you've been quite comfortable. Never better stabled in my life, said Bree. But if that husband of that tittering Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him. Aravis and Sara Lean had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Sara Lean would pretend that Aravis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were of course soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Sara Lean quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down beyond the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in dim light of the lamps. Presently, they came out into the garden court, which sloped down in a number of terraces. On the far side of that, they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and they found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the walls. Sara Lean halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. Go on, do go on, whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly and who still felt that her father might run into them at any corner. I'm just wondering, said Sara Lean. I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's left. What fun this is! They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all, and which soon began going down steps. It's all right, said Sara Lean. I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps. But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later, there appeared from down round a distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course, it is only before royalties that people walk backwards. Aravis felt Sara Lean grip her arm, that sort of sudden grip, which is almost a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Sara Lean should be so frightened of the Tisroc if he were really such a friend of hers, but there was no time to go on thinking. Sara Lean was hurrying her back to the top of the steps on tiptoes and groping wildly along the door. "Here's the door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in, drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear by Sara Lean's breathing that she was terrified. "Tash, preserve us," whispered Sara Lean. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered into a sofa. "Oh, let's lie down behind it," whimpered Sara Lean. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the girls got down. Sara Lean managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis's face stuck out behind the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they would not at once look, but of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try to make Sara Lean give her a little more room. But Sara Lean, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravis at last in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Sara Lean. "But my poor nerves." And then the most terrible noise that they could have heard at that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then came light, and because Aravis couldn't get her head any further in behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb as Aravis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils, walking backward and carrying the candles. They took up their stand one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was in front of her and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap by which she immediately knew that he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat and had such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans that Aravis couldn't help thinking the Narnian fashion, at any rate for man, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathery and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little humped-backed, wizened old man in whom she recognized with a shudder the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahashta Tarkhan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan, with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place, standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet. And that is the end of chapter 7. So you'll have to come back tomorrow night, and we'll read chapter 8, in the house of the Tisroc, and we'll find out what happens to Aravis and Sara Lean and Brihuin and Shasta. So I hope you have a good night. Thanks for joining me tonight. Bye.